Brazilian elections are coming, and for us covering Brazil, that means long days, late nights, calls that stretch past midnight, facts that need checking, sources that need finding, and a constant, urgent effort to make sure that the world is watching and paying attention. Because too often, it isn't. Latin America is still overlooked, misunderstood, reduced to dispatches that miss what actually matters, and we have decided to do something about it. Together, the Brazilian Report and the Brazil Office Alliance are launching a joint effort to make reliable, independent information about one of the world's largest democracies freely available to anyone who wants to understand it. Welcome to the International Observatory on Brazil's 2026 elections. Between now and October, we will produce podcasts and newsletters to bring reliable, independent, fact-checked information about Brazilian democracy available to audiences around the world. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and today I'm joined by James N. Green of the Brazil Office Alliance. James is a historian, professor, and one of the leading voices in the United States on U.S.-Brazil relations and Brazilian democracy. James, glad to have you. Thanks for being with me.
Between the Brazil Alliance and the Brazilian Report, which I read very carefully every week. So it's a wonderful production that you have done for us, a service to the world about what's going on in Brazil.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm very proud that we are doing this joint effort because likewise, I really admire the work that the Brazil Office Alliance is doing. I think this is important. And I think that too often we underappreciate and we underestimate the importance that outside forces have. And this is one of the things that we're going to discuss today. But first and foremost, I would like to bring something that was recently published, the VDEM Institute's Democracy Report for 2026, which is produced by the University of Gothenburg, now ranks Brazil above the United States in its flagship indexes for the quality of a democracy: egalitarian, electoral, liberal, and participatory democracy. Brazil now sits at the 28th position in the world. The US has plummeted from 20th to 51st, and for the first time has lost its status as a liberal democracy. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means both for Brazil and the US and also for the elections that we're about to experience in a 6-month time frame?
So first of all, it has to do with the current administration in Washington, which has really taken the country in the wrong direction. And there's no question about that. I'm not at all surprised at this new ranking. It's a shock to people in the United States who care about the traditions of democracy in this country, in the United States. And unfortunately, it reflects a series of attempts to undermine the democratic participation in the elections with new legislative proposals that would make it much harder for people to register to vote and to actually vote in the elections. And unfortunately, this is happening because the current administration of Donald Trump believes that they will lose in the midterm elections on November 3rd, and therefore trying to do everything possible to suppress voter turnout in order to guarantee that they retain a majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Why is this important for Brazil? Well, for two reasons. One, because Brazil has struggled over the course of its history to build and sustain democratic institutions, having gone in the 1960s and 70s through a military regime that would really damage the possibilities of it becoming a really true blossoming democracy. And since the end of the military regime has worked very hard to establish broad democratic institutions that serve all the people. One of the great examples is the electronic voting machines that they use, which are much more efficient and accurate than anything that is produced in the decentralized system of the United States and the 50 states. The other issue that I think is important to point out is that there is not the kind of interference that the current administration of Brazil is trying to do to change the outcome of the elections. That is the government of President Lula da Silva. Whereas unfortunately in the United States, the current president is trying to very much subvert the possibility of there being free, fair, national elections this November. The other issue is the ways in which the Donald Trump administration has suggested that they're going to interfere in the elections in Brazil by endorsing one of the candidates or carrying out other activities to undermine the legitimacy of the elections should their favorite candidate not win. And it seems their favorite candidate is clearly Flavio Bolsonaro, the son of Jair Bolsonaro.
Now, yes, you mentioned Flavio Bolsonaro, and many people last year would believe that Flavio Bolsonaro, a man who does not have his father's charisma and does not have his father's name recognition, would not stand as a powerful challenger to Lula, especially because in Brazil, incumbency bias is a real thing. I mean, especially if we compare to other Latin American countries, Brazil, to some extent, has a sort of welfare state that gives the incumbent so much more leverage when campaigning for re-election. But the polls are not showing that. The polls are actually showing that this race will be decided by a razor-thin margin, just like 4 years ago. Some polls even put Flavio Bolsonaro ahead of Lula in a statistical tie, but with 1 to 1.5 points above Lula. Now, we can argue that some of these polls, they are online polls, so that means that the sample is more skewed toward richer voters and more engaged voters, so that could mean that the numbers do not necessarily reflect voter sentiment. But this, as it stands, it seems that the elections is a coin flip. And it brings me to the question that I wanted to ask you, because I think there's a good parallel with the US. Brazil has saved democracy, has prevented a coup attempt after the 2022 elections, but Brazil has not fixed democracy. We still have alarming polarization, calcification of the Brazilian society towards one camp or the other remains a strong feature of our political life. And we still have the same forces that tried to overturn democracy 4 years ago, very close to power. So do you think that 2026 will be yet another election in which democracy hinges? I mean, maybe for some viewers, it's like every 4 years we say this is the most important election ever, but would you say that this is once again the case?
Well, I think anyone who's lived in the United States or watched the United States from afar this last year realize how a given election can be crucial. And in fact, the election of Donald Trump has changed everything in the world. And although I think Brazil doesn't have the same kind of reach that the United States has, the possibility that the extreme right could come back to power will remind people about how bad the Bolsonaro government was, the fact that over 700,000 people died of COVID because of a denialist who was not at all interested in taking care of the health of the people, and carrying out a series of other measures that were designed to undermine or to turn back or roll back many of the victories that were constructed over the period of
James,
democracy.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when we talk COVID, Bolsonaro was actually even more of a denialist than Trump was, because even Trump went for the vaccines way before Bolsonaro ever did, right?
He did, but on the other hand, he refuses even to take claim for the fact that he did do an amazing job, and I will recognize that in empowering the possibility of the invention of the discovery of measures for the vaccinations. However, at the same time, he continued to feed COVID denialism, and as a result of that, many people, over 1 million people died in the United States, and many of those people died because at the same time that he was accelerating the vaccination, he also was supporting people who were saying that the vaccination was fraudulent, that it wasn't going to be healthy, it was going to be dangerous, and that it wasn't necessary to have a mask. He refused to wear a mask in public. So he did a lot of things very similar to Bolsonaro in that regard. And his coming back to power, his second time in office has been, I would say, 10 times worse than the way he governed the first time that Trump was in office. And I think we can understand that this could be the same situation with Bolsonaro and the family, that the desire to get revenge, the desire to give an amnesty to all the people who were convicted of being involved in the coup d'etat attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and the possibility of taking revenge on those who he deems as the enemies of his family. And I think that's exactly what Trump has done. And there's been always a relationship of looking to, with the Jair Bolsonaro and with his family, looking to the United States as a reference point. And finally, the very close ties that Eduardo Bolsonaro has created in the United States with sectors of the far right in the US, in the Republican Party, that are very ominous signs for what could possibly happen in Brazil if he were elected to the presidency.
And I mean, you talked about the possibility of the US interfering with Brazil's election. I'd like just to remind that in 2022, the Biden administration was actually very important to keeping the military in Brazil in the barracks. There was a lot of pressure to prevent the Brazilian military from engaging with Bolsonaro's putschism, including threats to end military cooperation. It's not often that we say that, but in 2022, the US was instrumental to keeping a democracy alive in Latin America. And now we could see the other side of that coin, the US actively trying to tip the scales. And one of the things that worried many people within the Brazilian government was just a few days ago, Flavia Bolsonaro made a speech at the CPAC conference in Texas and essentially promised to give the US access to Brazil's rare earths, saying that Brazil is, and I quote, the solution to the US to no longer be dependent on China for rare earths and critical minerals. It seems a little bit on the nose in this sort of quid pro quo offer that you help us win the election and we will give you what you want. The US have been quite vocal in their pursuit of critical minerals in deals. They have done some deals in Brazil. So how do you see that dynamic playing out? How do you measure these risks, and by which means do you anticipate the Trump White House trying to interfere?
So first, there are many issues you raise. I'm going to see if I can summarize them quickly and concisely. The first of all is the tradition of the Trump administration of already interfering in the Argentinian elections, basically bribing the country, saying, we'll give you $20 billion to bail out the economy if you make sure that you vote against the forces that are against the government of Milei, the Peronistas, basically. And in fact, according to analysts in Argentina and also people I've talked to, that this was actually an important element in the fact that Milei won and increased his role in the Congress. So that was a direct intervention. Very different from what Joe Biden did. Joe Biden did not state he supported one candidate over another candidate. And his administration was crystal clear on this and meticulous about sending one message and one message only, that the United States believed in the Brazilian democracy, that it was a healthy democracy. They believed in the voting system in the country, and they wanted to support the outcome of the elections, but free and fair elections. And so it could have been that Jair Bolsonaro would have won re-election. It could have been that Lula would win, and he in fact did win. But the United States did not take a side, which is very different from what Trump is likely to do given his track record so far. What was positive is that message that was sent by the White House, by the State Department, by the CIA, by the Department of Defense, sent a clear message to the Brazilian armed forces. And we know now that a sector said, we're not going to join the proposal by Bolsonaro and the people around him to carry out a coup because we don't have the backing of the United States. And this is a military that's been trained with close collaboration with the United States since World War II. And I think rationally thought that if they were to embark on the coup attempt that was implemented, this plan was implemented, it was unsuccessful, that they would actually alienate the most important allies that the armed forces in Brazil had, namely the United States. So the challenge now is that we don't have someone in the White House who believes in democracy, who believes in free and fair elections, who is fixated on the fact that he insists that he lost the 2020 elections, and in fact trying to investigate again that the results of the elections to claim that it was a fraudulent election that he actually won, much as Bolsonaro claimed in 2022, and therefore launched the coup in January of 23. And so there's a real big difference there. The danger is that not only can Trump influence on a very close election. So let's imagine that the election is razor thin, and there's some question about the outcome and some challenging of the votes. Trump weighing in very clearly in favor of Flavia Bolsonaro could create a situation that would make it much harder for there to be a process to determine who did win the elections. And so it's kind of weighing in. That's one thing. And the other thing is consolidating Bolsonaro's base of support through messages that are circulated through fake news, through the social media, and through misinformation, which unfortunately is still a problem in the Brazilian elections and in the US elections. So there are different ways that there can be interference. And how does all relate to the rare earth minerals that Brazil has and that the United States is very interested in? I think the current president of Brazil has been very clear. We're willing to share our minerals with any country in the world to the extent that we get a fair deal. And if we supply these rare earth minerals to the United States, we want to do that in a way that will benefit Brazil and not reproduce a pattern of 500 years of merely exporting the wealth of the country to other countries without getting significant returns for that will help the country advance or to develop its own industries. So these are all the challenges that we're facing with this election. And I do really think it is the most important election that Brazil has faced since it returned to democracy.
And I mean, we have many issues that could put Brazil in the crosshairs with the US, right? I mean, we have seen a sort of detente since Trump staged a tariff war against Brazil last year. He and President Lula have talked in good terms, but it is still a relationship that remains very fragile. And there are several issues that could deteriorate that relationship again. One of them, and you mentioned the issue of fake news, the Brazilian government defends more regulation to social media. The Brazilian Supreme Court last year ruled that social media provider platforms, they are more responsible for third-party content than the changing regulations that said that they bore no responsibility whatsoever for it. So imposing a sort of duty of care to these platforms. But we also still have trade investigations against Brazil. We have a Section 301 that could bring tariffs and import quotas and a lot of restrictions to Brazil, and that could have a major impact on the Brazilian economy because the US is Brazil's #1 destination for industrialized goods. So how do you see, because Lula was expected to travel to Washington in March, that ended up not happening because of the war in Iran. What are you hearing in Washington about that relationship between Lula and Trump?
So we must never forget that part of the tariff restrictions on Brazil last year was demanding something extraordinary for Lula to interfere in the judicial process to pardon Bolsonaro. And of course, it was against the sovereignty of the nation and refused to do that, and including applying the Magnitsky Act on members of the Supreme Court. And in fact, Jim McGovern, who introduced the act into the US Congress, made a public statement saying that this was outrageous to use the Magnitsky Act in that regard because it was not the intention when he drafted the legislation that was approved for it to go in this direction, alleged human rights violations when they did not exist. So that's a past action, which is very dangerous. And you're right, the Brazilian diplomats through the Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, have been very successful in kind of lowering the heat between the two countries and trying to find ways to negotiate. The fact that the meeting has been postponed, I think, is reflective of a caution that Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, has had to make sure that the meeting that takes place is not one like the ones that Trump has carried out in the past, basically insulting and treating very poorly other foreign visitors to the United States who've gone to the White House. And so there's a caution there. And I think a real concern that the event, if it does take place, will be one in which there will be kind of mutual respect between the two countries in spite of differences. Now, it's true that Lula is an amazingly charismatic person who managed to kind of charm Trump, and Trump is a person who needs to be given attention to and to be charmed. And so there's a kind of a situation there which is favorable to Brazil in this moment. But we have to keep in mind that Trump is an extremely erratic person who one never knows what he's going to do tomorrow. And he could continue a positive relationship with Brazil, or he could be influenced by people around him, indirect influence from Eduardo Bolsonaro to Steve Bannon to the White House, and flip on this question and come up with a series of accusations against Brazil, which could be very harmful. And the most important one is the discussion in the United States of insisting that two criminal gangs in Brazil that have been involved in drug trafficking and violence and extortion, etc., will be considered terrorist organizations, and therefore the United States feels that it has the right to intervene in other countries' affairs if it is getting rid of a terrorist threat to the United States. And so creating a false narrative about the fact that these two criminal organizations are terrorist organizations opens the door for the possibility of the United States justifying some kind of intervention, as they did in Venezuela, which was the basic underlying argument about why the United States went into the country and took out its leader, and is now claiming that it has the right to have access to Venezuelan oil. So this is a serious threat, and there's a past practice. This is not a conspiracy theory or a fantasy that people have. This is a real possibility, although I think Brazil is not Venezuela in terms of the possibilities of that kind of direct action happening. I think it's going to be a much more indirect interference in the process in Brazil. And I think also, to be very frank, the ways in which the Iran war is not going the way that Trump imagined it would be is creating a situation in which the State Department and the US government is a little bit more cautious about perhaps carrying out some adventurous activities in Latin America in the immediate future.
And I mean, one other thing that I wanted to ask you about is because the US are heading to midterm elections right around the same time that Brazil will have its general election. So Brazil will hold votes in the first and last weeks of October, and then in November, the US goes to its midterm elections. Now, the Democrats have already flipped at least 30 seats since 2024. Many polls show a deterioration in Trump's approval ratings. Do you think this kind of thing would increase Trump's likelihood of doing some rogue things in Latin America, or the issue with the midterms would lead Trump to focus more on internal matters rather than on Brazilian affairs?
It's a good point. And so the American elections are on November 3rd. They're going to be 10 days after the second round of the Brazilian elections, when there will be an announcement of who the president is soon after the electoral results are officialized by the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court. So there's two game possibilities here. One is that Trump is so absorbed, as you suggest, that he won't have time to think about what's going on in Brazil. The second is that he could have lost, and he will lose. I can predict this clearly. He's going to lose control of the House of Representatives. There's no way that that's not going to happen. It's really not clear yet whether he'll lose control of the Senate, but it's a theoretical possibility, where 6 months ago it wasn't, because of the economic situation, because of the fact that the 60% of the American population does not agree on any of Trump's policies, although that's concentrated among independent voters and Democrats, and Republicans still support widely Trump. But the possibility could also happen that, having lost the elections, Trump needs to flex his muscle and show that he's total powerful, and so he could possibly weigh in very heavily on what's happening in Brazil, if there's still a question about who is the legitimate victor of the Brazilian elections, if the election results are so tight. In addition to whether or not he's paying attention in the coming up to the November 3rd elections in the United States, there are people around him, people who are influencing the White House, people from Brazil who are in the United States trying to influence the election results, who are still going to be at play. And I doubt that they're going to disappear or be quiet during this period, even if Trump is not paying a lot of attention to Brazil. And so there is a serious and ongoing real threat from the United States to challenging the legitimacy and the electoral process in Brazil. We need to be very aware of this. The Brazil Office Alliance is working very closely within the Congress to educate policymakers and staff and opinion makers about the situation in Brazil so that they're aware of it. And in fact, if they see things happening on the part of the White House and the Republican Party that are hostile towards democracy in Brazil, we're hoping they'll speak out clearly and educate the world about these dangers to democracy in the country.
And one additional risk for Brazil is the fact that our transition from one term to the other is so long, right? We hold elections in October, then certification is only in December, and the new government takes office just in January. So we saw in 2022 that this long time frame between these milestones can give a lot of opportunity for ill-intended actors to pull something. And now I wanted to bring the discussion to Brazil and talk a little bit about some of the aspects of this upcoming race. Before I do that, our producer just reminded me that I never mentioned to our viewers that because this initiative is bringing free content to everyone, we ask that our viewers and readers support us. So we have a QR code on the top right corner of the screen, and you can flash it and you can donate a cup of coffee to our journalists and to our political scientists, and that will be very much appreciated. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, and all of the money that we raise from donations will go to this initiative of funding the Observatory for the 2026 elections. It will be used to increase coverage, to increase staffing. So it will be used to raise awareness about the election. Now, James, coming back to Brazil and talking about our internal dynamics, once again, and for the third straight election, this presidential race will be a contest between Bolsonarism and Lulism. Now, why does a quote-unquote third way never flourishes in Brazil? We can, and if I may already start answering my own question, but one of the reasons may be because there's no real true alternative to both camps. Like many times it's just conservatives that are close to Bolsonaro just branding themselves as something different. But do you see it as it more of a problem of demand or supply? Do voters really want an alternative, or is just that the political field is not providing them one?
I think that the political situation over the course of time has really created a situation in which the country truly is polarized on two visions of where the country should go in the future. And one is one of I would say, a liberal social democracy, which is trying to overcome historic inequality and other issues of environmental degradation. And another side is really aligned with a vision of the world which does not believe that the kind of democracy that has been achieved over the years needs to be sustained, and is very interested in supporting economic interests that are not necessarily thinking about the country as a whole. And that's a reality in which almost there's only one way to be. You have to take sides. There's no other third way out of this situation. And as we've seen, as you pointed out, even though there are over 28 political parties, at the end of the day, they tend to go into two camps, with a large number of parties in the middle looking to judge who's going to win, and therefore aligning with that camp so they can then be a part of the government. We have a Congress in Brazil, which unfortunately is filled with Congress people who are only interested in lining their pockets and creating a situation for them to stay in power for their personal benefit or the benefit of their ideological viewpoint of the country. And so it's a situation which I don't see. There's no way in my mind there's going to be a third force that's going to come to play here. Clearly, Lula is a historically well-known and candidate that has a large social base. Bolsonarismo also has the same. It's not clear to what extent it will wane in the next period of time, but I think it's reflecting in a different way the politics of Brazil between 45 and 64 in terms of the kind of division in the electorate, with that middle ground sharply dividing between the two sides. And so, whereas in the past there were kind of three blocks, that middle block has just evaporated over the course of time, and the main sectors of the center-left, center-right party, the PSDB, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, has shattered, and some forces have gone to the left and others have gone to the right. So I think there really is no other force that is sustainable in this point at this time. Now, in the future, it's going to be difficult, because if Bolsonaro loses this election, I think the Bolsonaro trademark loses its weight and strength, and Lula clearly is not going to run for a fifth term. He's not even eligible to do that. So we have a situation in the next set of elections, and in 2030, there's going to have to be a whole different dynamic of candidates and people and parties that will emerge, and we'll see by that time whether this ongoing polarization continues.
Now, James, I would like to bring up another point that I think is important for that lack of a third way, and let me know if you agree with me or not. But I think one other problem is that many of that, I think there is a demand in the Brazilian electorate for an alternative, someone who defends democracy but does not necessarily align ideologically with Lula. The problem is many people that could fill that void, they only show up every 4 years. And I mean, like it or not, the only two guys that are actually doing the political grassroots work day in, day out are the Bolsonaros and Lula. So, I mean, you can say Marina Silva, the fact that she got 20 million plus votes in 2010 and 2014, that proves that the country wants an alternative. But even if Marina is one of the most important Brazilians that ever lived, when it talks about the courtship towards voters, many voters only see her face every 4 years. And you could say the same thing about, for instance, to mention a conservative, Eduardo Leite, the governor of Rio Grande do Sul. He is a conservative, but I mean, the way that he has reacted to Bolsonaro really sets him apart from other conservative governors. He has not been the sycophant that other governors have been when trying not to lose support from the Bolsonarista coalition. But still, no name recognition, and he has largely been absent from nationwide discussions for years. And now, a few months away from the election, just thinks you can waltz in and convince everyone that you can be competitive. It doesn't work like that, right?
No, it doesn't. And the other thing you have to consider is that the fact that the Workers' Party, since it was founded in 1980, is the only political party that has built a grassroots base of support, which has a certain amount of ideological coherency. Although there are many, many different points of view within the Workers' Party, it's not a monolithic in terms of its ideological perspective, but it has that loyalty base, as does Lula individually. So there's kind of two factors that favor the center-left coalition being ongoing, and that doesn't really exist among the right. I mean, the party that Bolsonaro will be running under is not a party that has popular support. The coalition that they build are political parties that are really based on candidates and political interests that they have in a given state or in a given sector of the economy, but don't have that kind of mass alliance that did exist between 1945 and 1964 within the two major political parties, the three major political parties. And it has only existed really with the loyalty towards the Workers' Party. Other parties that had a certain amount of loyal base, I think, have lost that, in part because the parties have disappointed the voters in terms of what they promised and what they've not been able to carry out. So we're in a situation in which the polarization is very strong and very deep, but I think the left manages to maintain a loyal base of 30% and then takes it over the top in recent elections by getting the majority in the second round of the elections. I'm a little worried about our time. Do we have a little bit more time? I think we might need to wrap up a little bit.
We're still just 35 minutes in, but
Okay, no, fine. Good. Let's go for
I
it.
can ask you. Let me ask you just a couple of questions more. One is, so you mentioned the Workers' Party, and this is a great segue to a question that I had prepared. Is Edinho Silva, the party chairman, he just published an op-ed talking about another front, broad front for democracy, and that was the motto of the Lula campaign in 2022. And he brought a coalition from radical Trotskyists to liberal center-right politicians. So he got everyone in the spectrum that was not in the far right to support him. And that allowed him to do something that had never been done, which is to unseat an incumbent by a razor-thin margin, but still remarkable feat. Do you think a broad front is possible in 2026? Because the Lula administration has been criticized a lot by conservatives for, in their view, winning the election as a broad front, governing as a center-left government in terms of economic policy and in terms of many other social policies. How do you see those criticisms?
I mean, I think a broad front understood in the context of Brazil is a center-left front. It's not one that brings far right or right forces into it. You can make a big argument around that. The people within the PSDB who voted for Lula, the fact that Geraldo Alckmin was his vice presidential candidate, will be his vice presidential candidate in this election, is one sign, keeping in mind that Alckmin was campaigning against the Workers' Party, was the opponent of the Workers' Party in the past, and joined that front. So I think it's one that again reaches into the center, to the right, but among people who really believe in democracy and understand that. And it's not going to be one that's going to attract those forces who are ideologically more comfortable with what Bolsonaro and what his party means or what his program means for the country. So I do think he's offering that broad front again. I think there's a very interesting poll that came out last week. I was very surprised that Fernando Haddad, who will be the candidate for governor in the state of São Paulo against Tarcísio Freitas, who is a supporter of Bolsonaro, that he is only behind from 42 to 42. He's getting 42% of the polls support against Freitas, who's getting 47. And that's remarkably thin difference between the two, considering the tradition of São Paulo, which tends to vote for conservative candidates. And so I think that's some indication that the situation is not as desperate as some people are thinking it is when they look at the national polls of Lula versus Flavio Bolsonaro.
Yes, and I mean, these polls, they are a snapshot of an electorate that is still not on election mode. The elections are just 6 months away. And in Brazil, we see a lot of polls showing that people sometimes decide their candidates while queuing to vote. So 6 months is a lifetime. Everything can happen in politics, and in Brazilian politics even more so. Now, James, I would like to thank you for this discussion. And before we go, we have messages from civil society organizations that we invited that are committed to defending Brazilian democracy and that are on not necessarily on a partisan way, but in just that mission of defending democracy. So we will leave our viewers with those messages. But James, it was a pleasure talking to you, and throughout this month until the campaign, we're going to do many more of these discussions. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I want to emphasize again the fabulous work that the Brazilian Report has done. I'm an avid reader, and also to emphasize that the Brazil office is a nonpartisan organization. It's not a political organization that supports a progressive agenda for Brazil, but is very clear that it's not favoring one or another candidate in the election. Thank you so much for inviting me today, and I'm looking forward to our ongoing podcasts and other activities we're going to be developing over the course of the next 6 months.
Have a great one, James. And for everyone else, thanks for joining us.
Oi, gente. Eu sou Luyara Franco, diretora executiva do Instituto Marielle Franco e filha de Marielle, aqui nessa liderança dessa organização que nasce depois de um dos nossos maiores atentados à democracia, né? Enfim, essa violência política de gênero e raça que atravessa ali o corpo da minha mãe. E hoje falar sobre eleições no Brasil, né? É necessariamente falar sobre quem pode existir na política e quem é sistematicamente impedido, né, de estar nela. A violência política de gênero e raça não é um efeito colateral do processo eleitoral, né? Ela é um mecanismo que tenta silenciar, constranger, expulsar e até eliminar, né, as mulheres, especialmente mulheres negras, do espaço do poder. No Brasil, a gente vê isso de uma forma brutal com o assassinato da minha mãe, mas também a gente vê depois, todos os dias, de forma contínua, através de ameaças, ataques virtuais. Ano passado, né, a gente aqui no Instituto lança uma violência política, uma pesquisa de violência política de gênero e raça no âmbito digital, o quanto que isso tem se aflorado nos últimos anos. Então é esse mecanismo de deslegitimação pública, né, desse isolamento político, mas ainda assim a gente segue, né, porque também é verdade que nos últimos anos mais mulheres negras, periféricas e comprometidas com a transformação social se decidiram, né, disputar a política institucional, e isso muda tudo. Muda a agenda pública, muda as prioridades e muda também a forma de fazer política. Muito também, inclusive, inspirado nesse símbolo de Marielle, né? E esse avanço não vem sem custo, né? A cada eleição cresce também essa sofisticação e essa intensidade das violências direcionadas para essas candidaturas. Então, por isso, falar das eleições livres e democráticas é falar obrigatoriamente, né, de segurança, de proteção e de condições reais de permanência para essas mulheres. Porque não basta garantir o direito de se candidatar, mas também é preciso garantir o direito de existir, de fazer campanha, de exercer os mandatos com dignidade. E aqui no Instituto a gente tem denunciado, tem acolhido, tem monitorado essa violência política de gênero e raça, além, né, de construir essas estratégias de proteção, de incidência para que essas mulheres não estejam sozinhas, né? Porque a democracia, ela só é plena quando ela é diversa. E eu acredito muito que não há democracia sem as mulheres e principalmente sem as mulheres negras, e quando todas puderem participar dela sem medo. E, enfim, o Observatório, né, Internacional das Eleições é uma iniciativa fundamental para esse momento, para dar visibilidade internacional a esses processos, porque também é uma forma de proteção e pressão, né, por responsabilidade. E a gente vai seguir dizendo que não há democracia sem mulheres, não há democracia sem mulheres negras e não há democracia com violência política. Acho que é isso.
Olá, meu nome é Conrado Hubner Mendes, sou professor de Direito Constitucional da USP e sou pesquisador do Centro de Análise da Liberdade do Autoritarismo, o Laut. Eu tenho estudado e escrito nos últimos vários anos sobre esse processo de erosão da democracia que ocorre em muitos lugares do mundo, ou seja, num processo de transição de um regime democrático para um regime autocrático. Essa linha divisória entre democracia e autocracia envolve muitas variáveis, mas uma delas, curiosamente, diz respeito às eleições. Eleições são um instrumento clássico e muito fundamental de expressão da vontade popular por meio do direito ao voto. E o curioso dessa história toda é que as eleições não são centrais apenas na democracia. Elas também são centrais nas autocracias contemporâneas. Ou seja, é muito importante usar das eleições em regimes autocráticos como forma de legitimação do autoritarismo, da violência e da opressão. Então, o que diferencia uma coisa da outra? A gente precisa desenvolver instrumentos mais refinados para identificar nesse sentido, a qualidade das eleições. E uma forma de resumir as eleições que são democráticas, diferentemente de eleições em regimes autocráticos, a partir de alguma fórmula. A fórmula mais sintética é que eleições democráticas precisam ser livres e justas. Ou seja, é necessário que os nossos direitos básicos, direitos civis e nossas liberdades básicas, para que o processo de emissão do voto e de expressão e formação da nossa opinião e dos nossos juízos seja feito num ambiente de liberdade. Não só de liberdade porque nós podemos nos manifestar, mas também liberdade de informação. Precisamos ter confiança de que as nossas informações são fidedignas, são realistas e as opiniões são baseadas em fato. Isso é um requisito mínimo de uma eleição democrática. Numa eleição autocrática, tudo isso desaparece. São eleições que acontecem sob um regime de intimidação, de violência, de disseminação de medo e de ódio, que são os sentimentos políticos mais antidemocráticos que nós podemos ter, e também de uma desconfiança permanente, fabricada, do processo eleitoral. O extremismo político tem feito isso ao redor do mundo. O extremismo político tem feito isso no Brasil. Fez em 2018, continuará a fazer em 2026, fez também na eleição seguinte, 2022, e não só fez isso, como até mesmo tentou um golpe de Estado, em relação ao qual sofreu condenação judicial. Nós precisamos ficar atentos nesse sentido em relação à qualidade das eleições de 2026, a qualidade do respeito a regras, a atuação da justiça eleitoral e a regulação dos mecanismos tão poderosos hoje em dia para se minar a manifestação popular do voto, a livre formação da nossa opinião e do voto.
Estamos mais uma vez diante de eleições decisivas para a democracia brasileira. E isso não é força de expressão. O Brasil não vive um momento de normalidade democrática. Há pouco mais de 3 anos enfrentamos uma tentativa de golpe de Estado, um episódio grave que deixou marcas profundas e cujas consequências seguimos enfrentando até hoje. As forças antidemocráticas que atacaram o Estado de Direito não desapareceram. Elas seguem organizadas, ativas e em busca de novas oportunidades para avançar um projeto de poder que ameaça a democracia. E há outro desafio urgente em 2026, a confiança nas eleições. Hoje, segundo pesquisas recentes, 43% do eleitorado brasileiro diz não confiar no sistema de votação. E esse dado não surge do nada, ele é resultado de campanhas sistemáticas de desinformação que colocaram em dúvida a legitimidade das urnas eletrônicas e das instituições eleitorais. Foi essa narrativa que ajudou a mobilizar milhares de brasileiros contra os poderes da República, culminando nos ataques de 8 de janeiro de 2023, um dos episódios mais graves da nossa história democrática recente. Diante desse cenário, o papel da sociedade civil é central. Cabe a nós fortalecer a confiança pública, proteger a integridade do processo eleitoral e garantir que as eleições de 2026 sejam seguras, transparentes, participativas, representativas e íntegras. Isso exige coordenação, exige colaboração e exige compromisso. A Constituição de 1988 nos deu as bases de um pacto democrático e é nossa responsabilidade coletiva fazer com que esse pacto seja respeitado e renovado a cada eleição. A sociedade civil brasileira sempre foi espaço de resistência, de criatividade e de ação, e não será diferente agora. O Pacto pela Democracia é uma coalizão apartidária e ideologicamente plural, com mais de 230 organizações sociais, está mobilizado mais uma vez para defender a integridade das eleições e fortalecer a democracia no Brasil, porque a democracia não está garantida, ela é construída todos os dias. E é isso que seguiremos fazendo juntos, hoje, amanhã e sempre. Obrigada.
Eu sou Pedro, diretor de programas do Democracia Hub, uma organização dedicada à construção de rede, apoio estratégico e capacitação para atores focados na defesa da democracia e no enfrentamento ao autoritarismo a nível internacional. Iniciativas como o Observatório Internacional das Eleições são de extrema importância esse ano, porque o risco de interferências internacionais no contexto eleitoral brasileiro não é só uma hipótese, ele já está virando uma realidade. A gente já está vendo ameaças veladas de possíveis intervenções militares futuras. A gente já está vendo mecanismos de chantagem econômica começando a surgir por parte de atores internacionais que querem pressionar políticos e atores brasileiros da sociedade civil que atuam nas eleições. A gente também já tem relatos de diversos encontros e reuniões de atores que estão no jogo eleitoral se reunindo com figuras de outros países conhecidas por atividades de espionagem, de sabotagem eleitoral, entre outras coisas. Então, nesse contexto, nós precisamos estar preparados. É importante dizer também que isso não está acontecendo só no Brasil. Interferências internacionais estão numa crescente mundo afora, tanto em países da América Latina quanto em países de fora da América Latina. Nós temos aqui na nossa vizinhança ataques muito explícitos a países como Venezuela, Cuba, México, Colômbia, Brasil também, entre os alvos, ainda não no nível de gravidade que vimos em outras partes, mas dentro desse contexto, mas não só aqui. A gente tem visto em partes da Europa ataques a processos eleitorais. Aconteceu agora há 2 semanas eleições na Eslovênia, onde foi desmascarada uma grande operação de espionagem, que inclusive mudou o curso das eleições. A gente está vendo isso em partes da Ásia. Então, esse é o contexto em que estamos. Esse tipo de ameaça é uma realidade e eu gostaria de poder dizer que isso é uma teoria da conspiração, que isso é uma paranoia, mas infelizmente é muito concreto o risco. Então, louvo a iniciativa. É muito importante que atores brasileiros e que atores aliados, né, de quem no Brasil está buscando eleições íntegras, juntem forças e garantam, de fato, que a gente trabalhe coletivamente para garantir a integridade do nosso processo eleitoral.
Olá, eu sou Viviana Santiago, sou diretora executiva da Oxfam Brasil. Pensar sobre os desafios relacionados ao próximo ciclo eleitoral é um exercício que requer da gente coragem, né? Requer muita resiliência e, sobretudo, a capacidade de esperançar, mesmo, né, que os desafios, mesmo agora, já pareçam, né, gigantescos. A gente está diante de um ciclo que, fundamentalmente, ele vai ser marcado pela polarização, né? Ainda que as pessoas digam que existe uma terceira via, que existe um caminho do meio, a gente sabe que não existe, que a gente está falando aqui entre a defesa intransigente da democracia e de direitos humanos e, né, a barbárie e a violação de direitos. A gente está falando aqui da defesa de interesses relacionados ao patriarcado, a um capitalismo, né, completamente, né, devastador, e a gente está falando da possibilidade de construção de políticas para a vida. É desse lugar, né, que a gente encara o próximo ciclo, temendo, né, uma avalanche de fake news, temendo, né, aqui, né, o que é que vai ser feito, qual o uso que será feito, né, da inteligência artificial e como que a gente vai se estruturar, né, para garantir ao máximo de pessoas o acesso, né, a mecanismos de consulta que possam fazê-las desafiar essas fake news e pensar na produção de verdades, né? Como é que a gente vai materializar democracia? Como é que a gente vai fazer a defesa da democracia nesse contexto? Será que a gente vai ter, né, suficiente imaginação política aqui no Brasil, né, as esquerdas, né, e aquelas pessoas que são aliadas à vida e aos direitos, né, para que a gente possa aparecer para o conjunto da população com uma alternativa viável? Essas são perguntas que a gente começa a se fazer, né, e pensar como é que a gente traduz isso tudo, né, para o miudinho, para o cotidiano da vida das pessoas. Como é que a gente fala sobre tudo isso de modo que faça sentido para quem está agindo os corre aí, para conseguir levar comida para casa todo dia. Como é que a gente mostra, né, que essa pretensa solução moral, né, que se apresenta, né, com os discursos ultraconservadores, ela não é solução nenhuma, ela é violação de direito. Como é que a gente aprende, né, com o que a gente vivenciou no último ciclo? Então, o nosso convite é o convite pela defesa de direitos e pela capacidade de conversar com mais pessoas dessa vez.
Conforme nos alertam os professores Levitsky e Ziblatt em sua obra magistral Como as Democracias Morrem, as democracias liberais, concebidas há mais de um século e consolidadas no pós-guerra, sofrem hoje a sua maior ameaça. Se trata do risco de autocratização das nossas sociedades, dos nossos governos. Essa autocratização é impulsionada por projetos políticos de viés autoritário que, utilizando-se do medo e do ódio como operadores políticos e da mentira como método, tratam de dividir as sociedades e radicalizar a política, a fim de corroer as instituições democráticas, atuando, nas palavras da presidenta do TSE, ministra Carmen Lúcia, como um cupim que corrói os andaimes das instituições democráticas. A condição de possibilidade para o desenvolvimento desses projetos autocráticos, como nos ensina outro professor, o professor Giuliano da Empoli, é baseada numa aliança entre o que ele chama de predadores, quais sejam esses candidatos a autocratas, aliados dos donos das Big Techs. Em sua outra obra, Engenheiros do Caos, da Empoli nos ensina como os spin doctors, os engenheiros dos caos, os estrategistas desses projetos autoritários, tratam de intoxicar a população, intoxicar a opinião pública, para que a decisão do voto seja baseada em aspectos emocionais pré-reflexivos que dividem as sociedades e colocam instituições e avanços civilizatórios até então inequívocos em xeque. Uma das estratégias mais poderosas dessa estratégia de desinformação é a desinformação eleitoral. Nós, do Instituto Democracia em Xeque, mostramos desde 2021 como esse tipo de procedimento poderia funcionar no país. Ainda mais grave, quando essas tentativas de manipulação da opinião pública por meio de desinformação coordenada e de divisão e radicalização da sociedade não são suficientes para que esses projetos autocráticos cheguem ou permaneçam no poder, eles colocam em xeque a rigidez dos sistemas eleitorais de votação. Vimos isso ocorrer com a suspeição do voto pelo correio nos Estados Unidos em 2020. Vimos isso ocorrer durante as eleições de 2022 no Brasil contra o sistema eletrônico de votação. Em ambos os casos, zero evidências que pudessem corroborar essas denúncias falsas. Isso não é gratuito, faz parte de uma tática a partir da qual a suspeição do sistema de votação abre a porta para que os resultados sejam questionados e que os eleitores desses projetos autocráticos se ponham indignados e se insurjam de forma violenta contra a transmissão de poder democrático. Por isso, iniciativas da sociedade civil coordenada internacionalmente são fundamentais quando uma eleição como a brasileira de 2026 ocorrerá sob a égide da suspeição por parte de um dos projetos políticos, que uma vez mais voltou a dizer que as eleições deveriam ser limpas e justas sem apresentar qualquer evidência. Nesse sentido, desde o Instituto Democracia em Xeque, louvamos a iniciativa do Brasil Office Alliance de criar um Observatório Internacional das Eleições, medida fundamental para que a sociedade civil global esteja atenta às instituições internacionais para que as eleições brasileiras possam ocorrer em tranquilidade e os resultados do povo soberano sejam respeitados. Bem-vindo ao Observatório Internacional das Eleições.